This world was created by Laplace, and when he departed from this world, he bestowed a gift upon humanity, which is the gift of abilities. In an orphanage, a nun led a prayer to thank Laplace while they enjoyed their meal. All the children began to savor their food except for one child. He bowed his head and said that Laplace was not fair. He compared the holy knights and warriors, stating they possessed powerful abilities, while he had a weak one. In the past, when Laplace protected the world, there were no abilities or attributes, and even monsters did not exist. Everyone was equal. The nun comforted the child. As the child wept, he wished to live in those times, and the sister embraced him. Another nun then arrived and reported that one of the orphanage's children had gone missing. The scene shifted to Sahara, who was tied to a building post. She was fearful because a man who had kidnapped her stood in front of her, saying that she would become a plaything for the holy knights. The man then left Sahara alone. As the man departed, Sahara began to cry, but her tears ceased when she heard footsteps approaching. Fate gently assured her that she would be all right. After Fate unshackled her, Sahara was surprised to see the man who had kidnapped her standing behind Fate. Fate was aware of his presence and reassured Sahara while drawing his sword. The man walked towards Fate, belittling his abilities. Fate, feeling cornered, was startled by Greed's voice. Greed offered advice on how to confront the man. After hearing Greed's advice, Fate stepped back while holding Sahara's hand, and the man casually pursued them from behind. The man continued to taunt and chase them. Greed then ordered Fate to push a nearby box, but the man managed to evade it. Fate then leaped and launched a direct attack, striking the man's cheek. He, pushed back by Fate's blow, activated his ability. Fate, witnessing this, did not waste the opportunity. He leaped and struck the man. The man tried to defend himself with his sword, but it couldn't withstand Fate's attack and broke in two. Fate's assault continued, striking the man's body. Fate proceeded to interrogate him, asking who had ordered him to kidnap the child. Initially, the man refused to answer, but after Fate stabbed his chest, he confessed that it was the holy knight Hado Vlarik who had given the order to kidnap the young child. Having successfully rescued Sahara, Fate then left the scene. As they walked, Sahara's stomach suddenly growled. With a gentle gaze, Fate offered Sahara some food and asked for her name while introducing himself. The scene shifted to Fate and Sahara in the city's marketplace, where he bought 2 skewers of meat. Fate gave one skewer to Sahara. While she ate the meat, Sahara cried because it was her first time eating meat. A nun who was leaving the orphanage was surprised to find Sahara in front of her. She ran to embrace her, and Sahara cried in the nun's arms. After a while, Sahara stopped crying and thanked Fate. Fate was taken aback by this, as he had never received a word of thanks before due to his weak abilities, which only left him feeling hungry. Fate approached Sahara and the nun and gave Sahara some advice, just as his father had told him when he was a child. Afterward, Fate left the place. Fate, who successfully defeated the man who kidnapped Sahara, acquired a new ability, the one-handed sword technique. With this technique, he could access special moves, such as a secret technique that allowed him to attack twice in a single strike. In a momentary fight, there's no guarantee that the strongest will always win. Fate was determined to become stronger so that he could win without relying on luck. In a small bar located in a corner of the city, someone was discussing the murder of Lord Mason by the Holy Dragon in Gallia. Lord Mason was the head of the Hart family, and he had been succeeded by his daughter, Roxy. However, Lord Mason had been the one who kept the Holy Knights in check, and the old man was unsure if Roxy could fulfill that role. The old man continued to inquire about Fate from the bar's owner. The next day, Fate visited the Holy Knights district. He was amazed by the large mansion in front of him. While he was observing the surroundings, he heard a familiar voice calling out to him. Roxy, dressed in her usual attire, was approaching him. She was waiting for him and welcomed Fate's arrival. Fate, captivated by Roxy's beauty, was momentarily silent and complimented her appearance. Roxy, feeling flattered, returned the compliment. Without delay, Roxy guided Fate to visit a grave on the Hart family estate. She introduced Fate to her father's grave. He had passed away 5 days ago while fighting the Holy Dragon in Gallia. Gallia was a continent teeming with monsters, and one of the Holy Knight's tasks was to contain these creatures. The task was not supposed to be deadly, but the Holy Dragon, which had not left its lair for thousands of years, wiped out the forces led by Roxy's father. After hearing Roxy's story, Fate clenched his fists and shared in her sorrow. Roxy, who had become the head of the Hart family, then asked for Fate's assistance in making the mansion a pleasant place. Fate gladly accepted Roxy's request. At the same time, the head servant of the Hart family, Haru, walked over to them and Roxy introduced Fate to him. Haru, observing Fate with a sharp gaze, requested that he behave appropriately as a servant of the Hart family. After the introductions, Fate began to work. Having spent a week working for the Hart family, Fate had become familiar with the other servants. Initially, they thought Fate was a peculiar individual who talked to the sword. While they were joking around, Fate's stomach suddenly growled. He tried to explain his situation, but before he could finish, Haru approached and informed him that Roxy was calling him. In a garden filled with flowers, Roxy was sitting with a tea set. She poured tea into a cup for Fate and inquired about his well-being. Fate remained silent, lost in thought about his growing hunger. Roxy continued to call Fate by the name Faye. Fate, lost in thought, was surprised by the name and was reminded of his father who had been killed in a monster hunt. He asked Roxy why she called him Faye, and she explained that it was a name she considered family. When Fate requested to be called Fate, Roxy firmly refused. Fate's gaze suddenly became hazy and turned black. The scene continued with Fate lying down, opening his eyes and finding himself in his room. Just awakened, Fate saw a letter from Roxy suggesting that he take a break and rest. He then asked Greed about his body's condition. Greed explained that after the Gluttony ability sensed a soul, it would never stop. The more Fate consumed, the stronger the desire became. Fate was destined to seek out souls to devour until he died. If he didn't consume souls, he would starve to death or lose control and attack anyone in front of him. When his hunger reached its limit, it would be evident in Fate's eyes, which would turn red. Fate then slipped out and walked among the adventurers who were gathering. Due to his heightened hunger-enhancing ability, he could see more clearly at night, sharpen his sense of smell, and instill fear and helplessness in weaker enemies. Fate returned to the grassy field where the goblins were congregating, and without hesitation, he drew his sword and dispatched all the goblins before him. After eliminating all the goblins, Fate still felt unsatisfied. Hearing this, Greed suggested that Fate should go to the Hobgoblin Forest. Without much thought, Fate entered the forest, where he was greeted by 2 hobgoblins who attacked him. Fate swiftly ran and eliminated both hobgoblins. In the midst of the brightly moonlit Hobgoblin Forest, dozens of lifeless hobgoblins lay in his wake, and Fate sat amidst their corpses. He had finally been relieved of his tormenting hunger. As he was about to leave the forest, a loud crash came from within. A Goblin King was approaching Fate, carrying a human in one of his hands. The Goblin King had an incredibly high status and possessed the regeneration ability, which allowed him to heal wounds. Wanting that ability, Fate chased after the Goblin King. The Goblin King devoured the human in his hand, making Fate feel nauseous at the sight. Fate then sneaked up behind the Goblin King and attacked, slicing off the Goblin King's left hand. Fate briefly contemplated as he saw the severed body of the human in the Goblin King's hand. The one-handed Goblin King went berserk and launched a blind rampage at Fate. Fate managed to evade each attack. Encouraged by Greed, Fate stopped dodging and counterattacked. He parried the Goblin King's strikes and cleaved through its body. The Goblin King screamed, and Fate proceeded to stab its mouth. After defeating the Goblin King, Fate's Gluttony ability was activated. He gained the attributes and abilities possessed by the Goblin King. With his current status, Greed could access its first level. By absorbing Fate's attributes, Greed could access its other form. Greed requested all the attributes Fate had since they met. If Fate didn't unlock this level, he would lose the right to use Greed. Upon hearing this, Fate decided to sacrifice his own attributes and unlock Greed to the next level. Once agreed, Greed began to absorb Fate's attributes and started to shine. Then, Greed transformed into a magical bow. After the transformation, Greed realized that hobgoblins had been lurking around them all along. Greed asked Fate to test the power of its new form. Fate then drew the bow, and a magical arrow appeared, which he released. The arrow he fired would unfailingly hit the target he aimed for, suiting Fate perfectly. After the hunt was over, Fate left the Goblin King's ear at the orphanage where Sahara lived.